It began with a lie, or perhaps the universe itself had begun to fracture before my eyes. Orbital scans registered a graveyard of derelict ships hovering in perfect geometries around Vera Prime, yet no star charts recorded the system. The void was empty by all Imperial reckoning, and yet there it lingered, an anomaly that bled the senses. I, Inquisitor Malrek of the Ordo Malleus, accompanied by a contingent of Tempestus Scions and a Servo Skull Observer, descended to the surface under storm-blackened skies. Vera Prime's surface was a cathedral of decay. Jagged plateaus rose like broken teeth. The ruins of cities stretched in unnatural angles, buildings leaning impossibly as if gravity itself had a sense of humour, or malice. Sensors fluctuated violently. A simple scan of terrain data would return alternating elevations, simultaneously indicating cliffs where plains should lie. My retinue moved cautiously. Frost clung to the air in patches, melting mid-step, forming droplets that hung and hovered in defiance of physics. From the moment we touched down, the world was wrong. Metallic tang filled the mouth, not from the machinery, but from the air itself. Wind gusts carried whispers I could not place, syllables older than the Imperium, repeating in a pattern too precise to be random. I ordered my scions to log all readings, yet every servo skull I dispatched returned blank or incomprehensible data. Vox chatter became fragmented, repeating numbers in a guttural cadence. 12, 7, 7, 12. An echoing motif that would haunt the hours to come. We approached the first of many anomalous structures, a stone edifice partially buried in ash. Its facade was engraved with glyphs I could not immediately identify. The carvings were concentric, repeating patterns that seemed to distort in my peripheral vision, shifting subtly as I stared. I marked the finding in my log and instructed the scions to remain alert, noting the increasing failures in their equipment. A targeting array spun erratically, even when powered down. One of the Vox units emitted a high-pitched resonance, the tone aligning eerily with the whispering numbers. Our first steps into the ruins revealed environmental contradictions. Humidity and frost coexisted. Walls that should have been cold to the touch radiated warmth, while shadows behaved independently, stretching longer than the laws of geometry allowed. One scion, Sergeant Varick, paused mid-step, reporting a feeling of vertigo despite standing on solid stone. I observed the reading on his vitals, heart rate normal, yet his eyes darted to angles no physical structure could form. It was in the eastern quadrant of the ruins that the first micro-anomaly occurred. A hatch, sealed by ancient mechanisms, opened of its own accord. No force, no action, no trace of my scion's presence could explain it. Behind it lay a corridor, dark and yet illuminated by faintly pulsing glyphs, etched into the stone, echoing the concentric patterns on the exterior. The temperature here fluctuated sharply. I felt an icy draft on my right cheek, while the palm of my left hand burned, as though the air had been segmented into zones of contradictory thermodynamics. I ordered the team to advance cautiously. Every step forward was a test of both nerves and senses. Frost formed mid-air, twisted by unseen currents, condensing into fleeting shapes reminiscent of faces, human, Primarchian, twisted. These shapes flickered in and out of reality, vanishing if I looked directly at them. One scion attempted to document this phenomenon with a handheld visual recorder, only to find the footage a continuous loop of static interspersed with the repeating numbers. 12, 7, 7, 12. Telemetric readings began failing entirely. The Servo Skull Observer, normally immune to warp interference at these levels, trembled and emitted incomprehensible binary glyphs. I interpreted this as the first sign of psychic resonance emanating from the tomb below the surface. My instincts, honed over decades, told me that what we had arrived to observe was not merely a structure or a grave. It was a locus of something alien, ancient, and malign. Even the air itself resisted normal measurement. Humidity, temperature, and pressure fluctuated in a constant, imperceptible rhythm that defied logic. My throat was dry, yet the taste of iron persisted. Every exhalation formed a visible mist, but the mist clung to the scions selectively, moving independently before dissolving. The sun, dim, obscured by storm clouds, cast shadows that behaved incorrectly, lengths and angles contradicting their source. It was here, at the edge of the outer ruins, that I first heard the echo. Guttural, repeating numbers that seemed both spatially anchored and omnipresent. The echo followed Sergeant Varick as he approached the hatch. I recorded it meticulously in my log, noting its precision, repetition, and effect. A subtle trembling in the hands, a prickling across the scalp, and a sense of being observed, not by one entity, but by a chorus of presences. We made camp nearby to calibrate our equipment and perform initial psychic scans. I cautioned the scions against speculation. Log entries and procedural adherence were paramount. Yet even in the sterile confines of our temporary command post, the anomalies persisted. Shadows moved without source. Machines failed. Numbers repeated on displays in sequences that made no arithmetic sense. The final lingering impression of the day was the storm itself. Lightning struck in patterns that did not obey probability, arcs leaping horizontally and upward, striking stone with whispers that seemed deliberate. The echo continued, insistent. 12. 7. 7. 12. A cadence that would chase my thoughts long after sleep became impossible. I signed my initial log entry with a grim acknowledgement. We had arrived on Vera Prime, and the tomb we sought was not inert. It watched, it remembered, and it would not allow us to leave unaltered. Micro cliffhanger. From the hatch beyond the ruins, a shadow detached itself from the darkness, moving with precision toward the nearest scion, yet sensors recorded nothing. A whisper, barely perceptible, tickled the edge of my mind. You are already here. We had entered the ruins of Vera Prime under a sky that seemed to weigh upon the shoulders like a physical mass. I, Inquisitor Malrek, logged each observation with deliberate care, knowing that these words might be all that remained of us. Our small detachment of Tempestus scions moved in a tight formation, weapons primed, servo skulls hovering on automatic survey. The anomalies had begun to assert themselves more aggressively. The first sign was auditory. Numbers continued to echo in the ruins. 12, 7, 7, 12. But now they carried a resonance that vibrated in bone and sinew, skipping across our neural implants. Sergeant Varick attempted to record the sequence on a handheld Vox recorder. Playback yielded static, broken by faint whispers forming words, unintelligible yet alarming in cadence. When he repeated the sequence aloud, the walls answered back with a delayed, discordant version of his own voice. We approached what remained of a civic structure, partially collapsed. The architecture betrayed impossible angles. Staircases terminated in mid-air, corridors bent at degrees that defied geometry. Every step caused a subtle shift in perception. Frost formed on our armor in patches, seemingly drawn to the glyphs etched into the walls. The air was cold, yet every breath left a taste of iron. Telemetry revealed erratic readings. Magnetic flux spiked in regions where no metal existed, and thermal sensors reported a continuous gradient from sub-zero to boiling within a meter. Vox chatter carried fragments of conversations the scions had not yet had, as though the ruins were replaying memory or thought. Sergeant Varick swore he heard his father's voice warning him to flee. It left him trembling and muttering liturgies in broken fragments. As we advanced, the first true casualty occurred. Trooper Callan, walking closest to the eastern corridor, vanished mid-step. 1 second he was beside me, reporting a distortion in the floor's resonance. The next, the shadows swallowed him. Vox feed captured only a high-pitched scream, warped and echoing in impossible directions. Our sensors found no trace, neither heat signature nor body. But the floor retained a faint impression of his boots, as if reality had recorded him and then erased him. I ordered the scions to form a perimeter, secure the area, and continue scanning. They obeyed mechanically, though their eyes betrayed unease. A recurring motif revealed itself. The glyphs lining the corridor began to pulse in sequence, and each pulse coincided with a minor equipment failure. A weapon discharged a single round unprompted. A servo skull's camera flickered violently. The sequence of glyph pulses seemed to align with the repeating numbers, though its purpose remained opaque. We entered what appeared to be an observation hall, its ceiling arched impossibly high, fracturing perception of distance and scale. A faint blue mist filled the air, condensing on armor in frost, dissolving in heat, then reforming in impossible shapes. The walls were lined with inscriptions, some scratched crudely, others carved with precision reminiscent of Mechanicus ciphers. There was a pattern, a repetition that hinted at ritual, yet its function was indecipherable. Comms began to fail. Channels carried overlapping fragments of our own speech, slightly delayed, layered with chanting. A distorted chorus began to chant numbers, matching the sequence we had already noted. One scion pointed at the ceiling where shadows converged, forming vague humanoid outlines, though no physical source could be identified. I recognized the phenomenon as a psychic bleed, localized and amplified by the anomalous structure of the ruins. As we moved deeper, a small cache of relics appeared. They seemed mundane: broken weapons, scorched armor plates, and fragments of old psychers' robes. Yet each bore glyphs and symbols I recognized from forbidden texts. One fragment contained a notation of a Primarch-era date, indicating that our predecessors had attempted excavation centuries ago, all mysteriously disappearing. I made note of it. This was not the first incursion, and the anomaly endured, patient and calculating. Flesh horror made its first real appearance. A humanoid form emerged from the shadows, half decayed, half stone, its eyes empty yet aware. It moved slowly, dragging a leg fused with jagged metal fragments. Vox chatter captured a fragmented plea. "Do not disturb." But the voice was layered with dozens of others, like a choir of warnings. The figure faded as quickly as it appeared, leaving nothing but a scorch mark on the wall and a lingering metallic stench. I ordered temporary containment measures, wards drawn from liturgical texts, electronic barriers, and psychic suppressants. Yet the ruins seemed to anticipate us. The glyphs pulsed with new intensity, synchronized with our own heartbeats as measured by internal sensors. Each pulse left a subtle distortion in our perception. The walls themselves seemed to breathe. We discovered the outer defenses of the tomb. Massive doors, engraved with concentric numbers and star patterns, were partially buried in rubble. Sensors could not penetrate. Vox readings distorted, repeating our own commands with delays and slight pitch shifts, almost as if the ruins were mocking our authority. Every step closer increased the ambient psychic pressure. Scions reported nausea, vertigo, and vivid hallucinations. Micro cliffhanger. As I stepped to record the glyph sequences, a shadow detached itself from a wall, moving with intent towards Sergeant Varick. Sensors detected nothing. His voice froze mid-command, eyes wide. The Vox captured only a whisper in a dialect older than the Emperor himself. "You are already counted." The ruins were no longer a passive environment. They had begun to interact with us, anticipate our movements, and test our fortitude. Each anomaly, the echoes, the vanishings, the impossible architecture, was a prelude. And I knew, with an unease that penetrated both reason and faith, that what lay at the heart of this tomb would be unlike any enemy we had faced. The chapter ended with a tense pause. Scions checked weapons and scanned the corridors. The repeating numbers continued to echo, synchronized with our own breathing. And from the hatch at the end of the hallway, a faint blue glow pulsed, beckoning, impossible, and alive. The vanishing of Trooper Callan had shattered the fragile composure of my retinue, yet discipline held, for fear of me. if not of the Emperor. I logged his absence as consumed by spatial resonance and pressed us forward. To falter now was to invite madness. Our destination was a half-buried outpost of the Adeptus Mechanicus, identified on corrupted cartographic records retrieved from orbit. The ruins of their habitation jutted like blackened bones from the ash plains, half collapsed, yet still bristling with forgotten antennae and vox masts. The sigil of Mars had long since been worn smooth by time and storm, but I felt their presence before I saw it. A vibration, a hum beneath the stone, low and constant, as though the outpost itself still dreamed. We breached the rusted airlock with melter charges. Inside, dust and frost layered every surface, yet the machinery functioned intermittently, as if awakening from centuries of slumber. Servo skulls flitted in incomplete patrols, their lenses cracked, their wings fluttering weakly. They moved, without command, repeating the same looping path until colliding with walls, again and again, denting metal with each failed orbit. The archive chamber stank of ozone and burned insulation. Cogitators hummed erratically, runes flickering between binary code and incomprehensible glyphs. One display looped endlessly through 3 words in Binharic: "Do not count." Another froze mid-calculation, displaying a corrupted star chart with Vera Prime at its center. Entire constellations bent and folded around it, distorted as though pulled into an unseen gravity well. I accessed the data slate entries with caution. What fragments remained told of an expedition centuries earlier, tech priests dispatched to investigate seismic anomalies and electromagnetic pulses of unnatural origin. Their words were precise, clinical, and terrified. Resonance distortions increasing. Vox channels carry voices of deceased crew. Data corrupted. Probability of containment: 0. Final protocol: seal sanctum. Abandon mission. Erasure recommended. Yet the erasure had not been enacted. The outpost still lived, its machines twitching like half-dead nerves, unwilling to die. The scions fanned out, inspecting every corridor. One reported symbols etched into the walls by hands not mechanicus. They were the same concentric numbers we had seen before, carved with almost religious fervor, yet layered over the cog engrams of Mars. The overlap was obscene, faiths colliding, rituals merging. Sensory distortion worsened within the outpost. Air temperature shifted violently from corridor to corridor. In one hall, condensation froze into razor-sharp icicles, hanging like teeth. In the next, the walls steamed, droplets hissing upon contact with ceramite boots. Trooper Halvek touched a wall absent-mindedly and recoiled with a scream. His gauntlet had fused briefly to the metal, the skin beneath blistering though there was no flame. I recorded the injury. The tomb was no longer content to unsettle. It had begun to taste us. The most disturbing find lay deeper within. The remains of the Magos Biologis, fused to a chair before a flickering cogitator. His flesh had petrified, veins and sinew calcified into the machinery, his ribcage split open as though offering up its contents to the machine spirit. His skull was intact, lenses still glowing faintly, and when one scion reached forward to disable him, the corpse spoke. Not through lips or tongue, but through vox static. "You are accounted. You are accounted. You are accounted." Each repetition aligned with the pulses we had heard outside. My heart stilled for a moment, for I realized the pattern. The tomb was recording us, adding us to some vast ledger of presence, a census of the damned. The scions panicked, weapons raised, eyes darting. I forced them to discipline with threats of execution. To falter now would mean annihilation, but inside, I too felt the weight of dread pressing against the sanctum of my skull. We searched the Magos' logs. One fragment remained uncorrupted enough to pass. Containment achieved through harmonic nullification. Failure leads to manifestation. Seal is Primarch class. Do not open under any circumstance. Tomb is anchor. The words Primarch class sent a shiver through my veins. Which of the Emperor's lost sons had been interred here? And why had the Mechanicus sought to contain resonance rather than body? The answer was not in the data, only fragments, only dread. As we prepared to leave, the archive itself rebelled. Cogitators flared to life, spilling streams of numbers into the air, projectors casting glyphs onto walls and floors. The lights dimmed, then pulsed in time with a hidden heartbeat. A high-pitched whine filled the chamber, vibrating fillings, rattling bones. I ordered retreat, but the outpost would not release us so easily. Doors sealed unbidden. Servo skulls dived from ceilings, not in attack, but in ritual, tracing circles around us with laser pointers, their beams cutting patterns into the frost. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, bending against geometry. It was Trooper Halvek who screamed first. His visor displayed a reflection not his own, an aged version of his face, eyes sunken, mouth stitched shut with iron wire. The reflection moved a second behind him, lagging, delayed. Then it smiled. The scions dragged him back. He fought, babbling incoherently, shouting numbers, scratching glyphs into his armor plates with bloodied fingers. I struck him unconscious with the pommel of my weapon. Only silence stilled the contagion of panic. We escaped the outpost through a maintenance tunnel, the echo of that endless mechanical chant following us. You are accounted. Vox logs repeated it across channels without input. When we emerged into the storm again, frost clinging to armor, I allowed myself one grim thought. The tomb's corruption was not confined to its walls. It spread into stone, into machinery, into flesh. The Mechanicus had tried to suppress it and failed. Now it tested us as it had tested them. And though we had escaped the archive, we had not escaped the count. Micro cliffhanger. As we regrouped outside, telemetry spiked violently. A shadow passed across the sky. Vast, geometric, impossible. But when we raised our eyes, the heavens were empty. Only storm, only whisper, only the count continuing. 12, 7, 7, 12. The Withers family believed that by moving the children's graves closer to consecrated ground, the restless disturbances would cease. Yet, as history often shows, superstition has a way of clinging tightly to the human spirit. By the spring of 1857, the small New Mexico settlement had grown tired of whispered stories and fearful glances, but the soil itself seemed unwilling to forget. When the graves were reopened for the fourth reburial, those present swore the ground gave a sigh. The dry desert wind whipped through the cemetery, carrying with it what sounded like low voices, indistinct yet chilling. Farmers present at the exhumation insisted they heard children's laughter, thin and broken, as if echoing from beneath the earth. Though most dismissed it as nerves or the tricks of wind, others were shaken to their core. The coffins were again placed into the earth, this time under the guidance of a travelling priest who had come through the region. He spoke Latin prayers over the graves, sprinkling holy water, urging the restless spirits to find peace. Yet that night, the villagers claimed to hear scratching at their doors, as though small hands had clawed at the wood. Dogs barked madly until dawn, refusing to approach the cemetery. Some believed the children's spirits were calling for their parents, who themselves had died under strange circumstances. Others whispered that the family had been marked, cursed by a sin that no prayer could cleanse. By the 7th month, the disturbances grew bolder. Lanterns flickered out near the Withers plot. Travellers refused to pass through the settlement after dusk. And always, in the silence, people swore they could hear the faint murmurs of children, not crying, not screaming, but softly speaking, as though plotting some secret in the dark. The villagers began to avoid the cemetery entirely, yet they could not escape its grip. A schoolteacher, lodging near the graves, reported waking to find tiny footprints pressed into the dirt outside her window. She lived alone, yet the prints were fresh, leading away from the cemetery. The next morning, she left the town without a word. By the time the children were moved for the 6th burial, the settlement was unraveling. Rumors turned neighbor against neighbor. Some demanded the bodies be burned, while others argued that fire would only anger the spirits further. The priest, before departing, left a final warning. These children are not at rest, for they do not seek rest, they seek remembrance. Still, the voices continued. Always in the night, always near the graves. By the autumn of 1857, the settlement was living under a pall of dread. The Withers children had already been reburied 6 times, each move accompanied by fresh terror. But the 7th, 8th, 9th, and beyond would become something else entirely. Ritual, compulsion, obsession. Each attempt to lay them to rest seemed only to deepen the unease. By the time of the 9th reburial, the villagers no longer spoke of peace or rest. They spoke only of survival. Crops began to fail in the thin desert soil, as though even the land had grown weary of the constant disturbance. Families left in the night, abandoning homes they had built with their own hands. Those who stayed swore they heard the children more clearly now. No longer just murmurs, but whispers, names, always the names of the living. A rancher's wife reported waking to the sound of her own son's name called softly from the darkness, spoken in the voice of a child long dead. The 10th reburial was performed not in daylight, but under torchlight, in the dead of night. The decision was made in fear. Perhaps the children belonged to darkness now, and to move them by sun was a mistake. Men dug while women wept, and when the coffins were lowered again, the torches sputtered as though a breath had passed through the flames. But nothing ended. By the 12th reburial, there was no priest, no prayer, only desperate hands moving soil from one shallow grave to another. The children's coffins were lighter now, some said impossibly so. A farmer whispered that when he carried one, it felt as though something inside shifted, not bones, but something alive. The 13th was the final reburial. The settlement gathered in silence, each face pale with exhaustion and fear. No words were spoken. The coffins were lowered one last time, deep into the ground, under a lone, crooked tree at the edge of the cemetery. The villagers swore never to open them again, and yet that night the murmurs continued. But something had changed. They were no longer scattered voices, no longer half-heard whispers in the wind. Instead, the people of the town claimed they heard them together, in chorus, 13 voices speaking as one, rising from beneath the soil. The words were not clear. Some swore they were prayers, others said curses, but all agreed on one thing. The Withers children had never been buried at all. They had been planted, and what grows from such a seed? None dared to imagine. The 13th reburial should have ended it. That was the oath the settlers of San Pedro made to themselves. But the earth refused to be silent. In the weeks that followed, the settlement was plagued by strange occurrences. Horses broke free of their pens at night, running in wild circles until they collapsed foaming and exhausted. Lanterns burned without oil, flickering long after their wicks should have been dead. Doors swung open at dusk, no matter how tightly they were barred. The most terrifying were the dreams. Entire families reported the same vision, standing beneath the crooked cemetery tree, watching 13 small shadows sway from its branches. The children did not hang by ropes, but by strands of pale root, as though the earth itself had grown claws to drag them back. By November, whispers spread through nearby towns. Travelers claimed San Pedro was cursed. One merchant refused to pass through after sundown, saying he had seen children walking alongside his wagon, children who left no tracks in the dust. The Withers homestead stood abandoned, but people swore smoke still rose from its chimney. A few men, drunk on whiskey and bravado, tried to prove the tales false. They entered the farmhouse one night with torches. Only 2 came back. The third, a man named Elias Rowe, was never found. His torch was discovered in the dirt road the next morning, burned to a black stub. By the winter of 1857, San Pedro had become a ghost town in all but name. Families fled, leaving doors unlocked and belongings behind. Those who remained lived in silence, never venturing out after dark. Yet through it all, the voices of the Wither's children grew louder. One settler, a woman named Martha Hensley, kept a diary. In her final entry, she wrote, "They are not resting. They never rest. Last night I heard them outside my door, calling not for their mother, but for me. I fear soon they will not be content with whispers. They want to be let in." Martha vanished the next day. Her house was found empty, her bed still warm. But in the yard, the dirt had been disturbed, as though something had clawed its way up from below. The 13th grave had not sealed the curse, it had rooted it, and now San Pedro was the soil. The winter of 1857 was unlike any the settlers of San Pedro had endured before. The desert winds howled longer, colder, sharper, as though the land itself was trying to drive them out. Ash-coloured clouds drifted over the mountains, choking the moonlight and plunging the nights into an endless black. Within that blackness, voices carried soft, playful, childlike, yet wrong. By this time, half the families had already abandoned their homesteads. The brave, the stubborn, and the desperate few who remained spoke little and trusted less. They kept to their cabins after sundown, whispering prayers with trembling lips, waiting for dawn as though it were salvation itself. But dawn brought little comfort. The graves of the Wither's children still shifted. Some days, fresh dirt would be scattered, as though the earth had been disturbed in the night. Other mornings, tiny handprints, far too small for any living child in the town, were found pressed into windowsills, doors, even along the edges of water troughs. It was in this atmosphere of dread that a stranger arrived. He came in on horseback, a tall man, with a wide-brimmed hat shadowing most of his face. His coat was travel-worn, dust clinging to its hem. He bore no insignia, no clear profession, though his saddle carried a rifle, and a rosary dangled conspicuously from his neck. The few who dared approach him asked his name. He answered simply, "Call me Avery." He did not offer more, and the townsfolk did not press. For San Pedro had learned that names carried weight, sometimes too much weight to bear. Avery lodged in the empty tavern, its owner long gone. The first night he sat alone by the fire, listening as wind rattled the broken shutters. Some claimed he wrote in a leather-bound journal, pausing now and then to look toward the cemetery hill through the cracked window pane. By the second day, rumours swirled. Some said Avery was a Pinkerton man, sent to investigate the disappearances. Others swore he was a preacher, his mission ordained by the church to cleanse the cursed settlement. A few whispered he was neither, that he was a gravedigger by trade, drawn to San Pedro like a vulture circling carrion. What no one disputed was that he had arrived with purpose. On the third night, Martha Hensley's diary, left behind in her deserted home, was delivered into his hands. The townsfolk hoped the stranger might know what to make of the last words written within it. Avery read the pages slowly, lips tightening at each passage. When he reached the final entry, his hand lingered on the ink, smudged as though written in great haste. "They knock upon my door, but they do not wait for me to answer." He closed the book. Without looking up, he muttered, "This is older than your town, older than the graves." The people exchanged fearful glances. Few dared ask what he meant. That same night, Avery ascended the hill to the cemetery. A handful of settlers followed at a distance, their lanterns swaying in the wind. Together they beheld the 13 mounds, uneven, sagging, as though the coffins beneath had shifted. At the foot of the crooked tree, Avery knelt. He pressed his palm into the earth, then drew back sharply, his skin damp with a faint moisture though the ground was dry. "Roots," he whispered. "But not of any tree I've known." One of the men scoffed nervously. "You speak of roots as though they breathe." Avery did not answer. His gaze lingered on the graves, his expression carved in stone. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of laughter. Childish, high-pitched, echoing across the barren desert. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Several of the settlers clutched their lanterns tighter, their eyes darting to the shadows. Avery rose slowly. They are bound here, but not buried. When he turned back toward the town, his face looked older than when he had arrived. In the following days, Avery became a quiet fixture of San Pedro. He attended no gatherings, there were none to attend, but walked the dusty streets with measured purpose. He spoke little, listened much, and took to carving strange symbols into the wood of his room at the tavern. One evening, he visited the Withers homestead. The settlers warned him away, recounting tales of those who had vanished inside. Avery ignored them. He entered at dusk, lantern in hand. Hours passed. Some claimed they saw a glow moving from room to room. Others swore they heard a woman singing softly, a lullaby, cracked and broken, but still carrying the cadence of comfort, twisted into grief. Avery emerged at midnight. His lantern was gone, but in his hand he carried a child's shoe, brittle with age. He placed it upon the tavern bar without a word and sat in silence until morning. By now the settlers had begun to place their hopes upon him. Perhaps this man, whoever he was, could put an end to the curse. But Avery made no promises. He only listened, his eyes shadowed, as they recounted the voices, the disappearances, the 13th reburial. Finally, after one particularly long night of silence, he spoke. You buried them 13 times, and in doing so, you gave them 13 doors. The meaning of his words was unclear, but his tone carried a finality that left the room cold. San Pedro, once a settlement of promise, was now reduced to whispers, fear, and a stranger who had arrived too late. Yet as the days grew shorter and the nights longer, the people clung to the faintest thread of hope, that perhaps Avery could do what they could not. But Avery himself knew a darker truth. The Withers' children were not waiting to be laid to rest. They were waiting to be released. And soon, someone would open the wrong door. When spring came to San Pedro, it brought no relief. The rains washed the earth, but the air still carried the same heavy stillness, as if the whole valley held its breath. What few settlers remained whispered of a phenomenon that began to occur with frightening regularity, the silent procession. It always began the same way. At dusk, the air would grow unnaturally cold, and all sounds of life, crickets, owls, even the wind, would cease. Then, out of the cemetery path, shapes would emerge. At first, indistinct, like shadows made solid by moonlight. Then, clearer, children. Small figures dressed in the tatters they had been buried in. Witnesses claimed they walked in single file, 13 in total, their heads bowed, their hands clasped as though in prayer. No sound ever came from them, not even the crunch of their bare feet on gravel. They would pass through the village, stopping before houses, pausing at windows as though counting the living inside. Then, just as suddenly, they would vanish, sometimes dissolving into mist, sometimes sinking into the earth as though it opened its mouth to swallow them whole. Some believed the children were looking for their mother. Others thought they were searching for new companions to join them in the soil. One night, a man named Carter Doyle tried to confront them. Armed with a rifle, he stood in the street as the procession approached. His neighbors watched from their shutters as he shouted curses, demanding they leave San Pedro for good. He raised his weapon and fired. The shot rang across the valley, but the bullet never touched its mark. Instead, the rifle exploded in his hands. Doyle's screams echoed long after his body was found sprawled on the ground. His chest burned black as though struck by lightning. That was the night people stopped speaking of resistance. No one dared confront the silent procession again. Instead, families hid in silence, praying the children would pass by their homes without pause. But not every house was spared. On April 17th, the procession halted before the home of the Sutter family. Neighbors later swore they saw the children gather at the doorstep, pressing their pale faces against the windows. The Sutters were never seen again. Their door was found wide open, their table set for supper, food still steaming. Chairs overturned, a candle burning low. No sign of struggle, no tracks in the dust. The family had simply vanished. By summer, San Pedro was a place no map acknowledged. Travelers avoided its roads, and those who dared enter seldom returned. The few who did spoke of an emptiness that clung to their bones, a silence so thick it smothered their thoughts. They said the village did not merely seem abandoned, it felt consumed. The silent procession continued, and each time they came, fewer lanterns burned in the windows of San Pedro. By the time July arrived, San Pedro was little more than a shadow of a town. Smoke rose intermittently from chimneys, though no one remained to tend fires. Empty carts lay toppled in the streets, and livestock had vanished entirely. The wind carried the faintest echoes of children's laughter, though the valley was silent, save for the whisper of leaves against abandoned doors. Avery, the stranger, had remained in the tavern for weeks. Unlike the villagers, he did not sleep in fear. Instead, he worked at the margins, walking the streets at night, inspecting the graves, and occasionally murmuring in a low voice to himself. Those few who observed him swore his movements were deliberate, ritualistic, and careful, as though he were measuring the very pulse of the valley. It was on a particularly sweltering night, the air thick with the smell of dust and rotting vegetation, that he returned to the cemetery. The 13 mounds lay under the crooked tree, its branches gnarled and blackened from decades of desert storms. The wind swirled around him in unnatural currents, carrying fragments of voice, names, faint and urgent. Avery paused at the first mound and pressed a hand to the dry soil. The earth moved beneath his palm, subtle, like it was alive, testing him. He knelt beside the largest grave, muttering a phrase in an ancient dialect no living settler could recognize. Sparks of light, pale and blue, seemed to seep from the cracks in the earth, illuminating the tree in a ghostly glow. The whispers intensified, layering into a single harmonic chorus, both beautiful and horrifying. As he worked, shadows moved among the mounds. At first, mere flits in the corner of vision, then solidifying into 13 small figures. The children's forms were translucent, their eyes hollow and black, yet with the faintest glimmer of intelligence. They did not approach him. Instead, they circled, shifting rhythmically as if conducting some invisible ritual. Avery spoke, not loudly, but in the same low tone he had used before. "I am not your enemy," he said, "but you have grown beyond the soil that birthed you." The children paused. One stepped forward, hand extended. It was smaller than any human hand should be, skin pale and cold as the desert night. Avery touched it lightly, and a shock ran through him. Not pain, but understanding. They were not simply spirits, not lost souls. They were an extension of something older, something bound to the valley, fed by repeated disturbance. Each reburial had strengthened them, given them consciousness, shape, and purpose, and now they were aware. The wind carried a new sound, a door opening. Avery spun to see one of the settlers approaching, drawn perhaps by curiosity or the hope that the stranger could wield power against the children. He was a young man, Thomas Grady, carrying a lantern. His steps faltered as he saw the spectral figures and the blue light bathing the mounds. "Stay back," Avery shouted. "Do not disturb them further." But Grady's fear had already tipped into fascination. The young man stepped forward anyway, and the children's heads turned as one toward him. A collective murmur rose from their lips, and the harmonic chorus warped into a dissonant, high-pitched scream. The lantern shook violently in Grady's hand before falling to the ground, breaking with a sharp crack. The children advanced, not rapidly, but in a glide-like motion, their movement uncanny and smooth. Avery placed himself between the spectral figures and Grady, muttering incantations in a tongue that twisted around the air. The earth trembled beneath them, subtle but undeniable. Roots cracked through soil and stone, breaking into fragments that rose like skeletal fingers. Grady screamed as one root wrapped around his ankle, pulling him to the ground. He kicked and thrashed, but the children merely hovered above, their silent eyes fixed. Avery reached for Grady and placed his hands on the root. With a hiss of displaced air and a low groan, the root released its grip, and Grady collapsed into Avery's arms, pale and trembling. The children vanished, not faded, but absorbed back into the soil, leaving no trace except faint impressions of their tiny feet pressed into the dirt. Avery lowered Grady to the ground, voice low but urgent. "They are patient," he said. "They are counting. Every disturbance, every burial, every soul that lingers nearby strengthens them. Do you understand? You cannot fight them. You can only survive long enough to see what they intend." Grady could not speak. He shivered in the desert night, aware of a dread that ran deeper than any tale the townsfolk had whispered. Avery rose and surveyed the graves. Each mound now seemed subtly taller, the soil pressed tightly, almost as if the children had reshaped it themselves. The crooked tree above quivered slightly in the night wind, though there was no gust strong enough to cause it. Avery placed a hand against its bark, feeling the pulse beneath, a rhythm not of sap, but of consciousness. "They do not belong to the living world anymore," he murmured, "and soon they will not belong even to this place." The wind shifted. From the distant edge of the valley, a new voice joined the chorus, a soft, low intonation, speaking a name none of them recognized. Avery stiffened, recognizing in the sound the herald of something larger, something older. The children had a master, or perhaps they had become one themselves. By the time he returned to the tavern, the first hint of dawn touched the horizon. Grady followed silently, aware of a terror he could not name. Avery entered the building, closed the door, and looked at the empty chairs and scattered debris. "San Pedro is no longer yours," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "It belongs to them, and soon the valley itself will obey their counting." The settlers who had not yet fled trembled at his words, sensing the truth even if they could not name it. The children had grown beyond earthly bounds, and Avery, whoever he truly was the only one who understood the rules they now played by. Micro cliffhanger. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of 13 tiny footsteps, moving in the opposite direction of the graves, toward the town, toward the last remaining inhabitants. And somewhere beneath the crooked tree, roots twisted once more, stretching beneath the soil as if reaching for something unseen. San Pedro had been silent for weeks, yet the silence itself carried weight. It was not merely the absence of sound, but the absence of life. Windows remained shuttered, doors unlatched only, to swing open to the wind, and the dust of the abandoned streets lay undisturbed, yet somehow uneven, as though something had passed and returned again, without leaving tracks. That night, Avery sat in the tavern, reviewing the scattered evidence of the children's growth. Small items were found arranged in patterns across the empty rooms, cups stacked in geometric arrays, books laid open in sequences of numbers, even the floorboards themselves etched with lines that pulsed faintly under his touch. He muttered quietly, as though invoking an unseen authority, translating the rhythm into harmonic sequences he alone could read. Then the first sound reached him. Not from the children, not yet, but from the earth itself. A groan low and resonant, like 1,000 hands pressing against soil and stone. Avery rose, lantern in hand, moving toward the front door. The streets were empty, at least at first glance. But then came the first manifestation. A shadow rose from the town square. Thin, elongated, flickering at the edges, and then taking form. One of the Wither's children, or a simulacrum of it, stood there, alone. Its head tilted unnaturally, eyes dark voids that reflected nothing, and a smile stretched impossibly across its small face. Avery approached carefully, recognizing the danger. "You are not to harm them. Yet," he muttered to himself, invoking an obscure litany meant to anchor consciousness against spectral interference. The figure did not respond. It merely watched. And then, as though signaled, others emerged. From alleyways, from broken doorways, from the soil itself. 13 in total. They glided across the streets with impossible grace, their motions synchronized, like dancers in a ritual. The harmonic chorus of their whispered counting began again, low and insidious, pressing against the eardrums of any who dared listen. A lone lantern flickered, revealing the first living victim. A settler, one of the few who had not fled, was standing frozen in the square, eyes wide in terror. He tried to speak, tried to run, but the children reached him with a silent swiftness that belied their small size. One touched his chest, fingers pressing lightly against bone and sinew. Immediately, his form began to twitch and distort, as if the flesh itself recognized the intrusion and could not resist. His eyes rolled back, the whites burning faintly, and then he crumpled into a heap of shivering limbs. Avery rushed forward, his hands tracing sigils in the air, reciting incantations to counteract the spectral corruption. The children paused, tilting their heads in unison, recognizing the authority that confronted them. Yet, even as they recoiled slightly, the town itself seemed to respond. Dust rose from cracks in the street, the floorboards shivered, and roots erupted from beneath foundations, snaking around buildings as if the soil itself were obeying the children. Through the tavern window, other settlers watched in horror. Those who had previously barricaded themselves now peered through the glass, understanding instinctively that survival was no longer a matter of staying inside. It was a matter of fleeing entirely or perishing under the first wave of the unnatural. Avery shouted, his voice carrying over the harmonic whispers. "Do not spread. Contain yourselves to the square." He began a counter-ritual, raising his hands above his head, eyes closed in concentration. The air shimmered, vibrating with the resonance of ancient tongues, and the children recoiled, voices warping into distorted cries. But the effect was temporary. The earth had been nourished by 13 reburials, by fear, by silence, by obsession. The children's power was no longer bound solely to the mounds. It had spread into the very valley, into stone, into wood, into dust and air. One by one, houses shook, windows splintered, doors burst open as though exhaling centuries of accumulated energy. Avery realized with chilling clarity, this was the first manifestation of what had been growing beneath the soil. And if unchecked, the entire town would be transformed into a playground for forces beyond comprehension. He lunged forward, gathering the first living victim in his arms, and recited a protective binding. The effect held for a moment, a fragile bubble of order in a town otherwise collapsing under its own supernatural weight. He glanced toward the crooked tree at the edge of the square. The branches twisted unnaturally, moving as if the tree itself had become sentient, reacting to the children's presence. Lightning struck the horizon. The wind carried voices now, counting, but in multiple layers, some distorted beyond human hearing. Avery understood that this was no longer just a haunting of San Pedro. The valley itself had become a conduit, a nexus point for energies awakened by repeated disturbances. He could not fight them all, not yet. But he could delay them, contain their movements, buy time for whoever remained alive. Each chant he invoked, each symbol he traced, held the children at bay, but only for a breath. The town groaned under the weight of unnatural law, and the children's eyes glimmered with awareness, acknowledging Avery's temporary dominion, but clearly planning beyond it. Then came the micro-cliffhanger. From the shadows behind the crooked tree, a larger figure began to emerge. It was human in shape, but far taller than any child could be, its limbs elongated, its proportions unnatural. Its presence carried the same harmonic resonance as the children, but deeper, older and more commanding. Avery froze, recognizing in that figure an intelligence older than the valley, perhaps the source of the children's growth, or a master waiting to step fully into the world. The wind stilled. The harmonic counting ceased abruptly, replaced by silence that pressed against the ears like water. And then, from deep beneath the soil, a low, resonant hum began, a summoning of power that promised to reshape San Pedro forever. Avery's eyes narrowed. The valley had become the stage for something older than fear, older than the dead. And in that silence he knew that the first full manifestation was only the beginning. The night fell heavy and silent over San Pedro, but this silence carried a weight far heavier than the absence of wind or life. It pressed against the few remaining settlers' lungs, made their hearts beat unevenly, and whispered of inevitability. Avery had spent the day tracing sigils along the streets, marking protective wards in dust and ash. But he knew these were only temporary measures. The children were aware of the symbols, and they did not fear them. They studied them, learned from them, and adapted. As twilight bled into darkness, the valley seemed to hold its breath. The harmonic counting that had accompanied the children's previous appearances returned, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, then rising in intensity. The 13 figures emerged again from the cemetery hill, gliding toward the town like a tide of shadows, their small forms silhouetted against the dim starlight. The remaining settlers huddled inside their shuttered homes, whispering prayers they no longer believed. Among them were 2 families, the Carters and the young Thomases, who had resisted fleeing for weeks, believing they could endure the hauntings. Their windows rattled as if something invisible was testing the glass, and faint tapping began along walls and doors, rhythmically, insistently. Avery moved quickly between houses, his lantern swinging, his hands tracing protective wards. He recited phrases in an ancient tongue, one whose syllables scraped the edges of comprehension. Each incantation rippled across the town, a temporary barrier against the children's influence. Yet he knew that the real danger lay in the entity that had emerged from the shadows behind the crooked tree. The larger figure that now lurked silently at the edge of the valley, observing, calculating, its presence resonating through the soil and air alike. The children began to interact more directly with the settlers. Small hands reached through cracked doors and windows, pressing cold fingers against faces and chests. Voices whispered from the walls, calling names, recounting sins, fears, and secrets. The Carters found themselves trapped in their parlor, unable to move, their hearts pounding as invisible fingers clutched at their throats and lungs. Outside, the harmonic counting intensified, now layered with whispers of a deeper resonance, the entity's presence amplifying the children's power. Avery rushed into the street, drawing a line of salt and ash, chanting louder than ever. The children stopped, hovering above the ground, heads tilting in unison. Their small, dark eyes glimmered with unnatural intelligence, studying him, learning, recognizing both threat and authority. But the entity at the tree stirred. The ground beneath it cracked and shifted, roots writhing like serpents, stretching toward the town's heart. A low hum emanated from beneath the soil, vibrating in every wall and floorboard, resonating directly with the children. Suddenly, one of the settlers, a man named Jeremiah, ventured out, believing he could confront the children or perhaps disrupt them. He stepped into the moonlight, rifle in hand, his lantern swaying. One of the children turned slowly, extending a hand. Jeremiah froze, the hair on his arm standing, and then screamed as the ground beneath him opened in a subtle yet violent way. Roots erupted, wrapping around his legs and torso, pulling him downward with an impossible force. The others inside could only watch as his cries were swallowed by the earth itself. Avery reacted instantly, throwing protective glyphs, reciting chants that forced the roots to release their hold temporarily. Jeremiah collapsed in the dirt, twitching violently, pale as death. Avery gripped his shoulders and whispered urgent incantations, forcing his consciousness into a fragile bubble of stability. But the effort drained him, his vision swimming as the harmonic resonance intensified. The children advanced in response, their whispers rising, now intelligible in parts. Count, count, count. Their voices seemed to manipulate the rhythm of time itself, stretching moments into eternities, bending perception. Every heartbeat felt exaggerated, every breath weighted. Those trapped in the houses found themselves reliving moments from the past, seeing loved ones lost, sins committed, failures remembered. The valley became a mirror of both memory and dread. Avery realized the entity at the tree was coordinating this. Its long limbs moved with the fluidity of shadows, touching the soil in a way that rippled through the town. Each interaction between the children and the settlers amplified the entity's control, strengthening the harmonic resonance. The town had become a stage for a ritual that had begun long before the first reburial and would not end without destruction or sacrifice. By midnight, the town square had transformed. Dust, ash, and soil swirled unnaturally, forming spirals and sigils that mirrored Avery's protective wards in mockery. The children now moved in two layers, one hovering directly above the ground, the other skimming across it, their motions synchronized to the harmonic resonance. The settlers still alive huddled, trembling, praying silently, aware that to make a sound or move improperly could draw attention. Avery turned to the entity, recognizing the inevitability. The children were not acting independently. They were extensions of something older, something that had waited patiently beneath the soil, fed by grief, fear, and ritual. And it was learning. Each act of interference, each protective ward, only informed its understanding of human resistance. He spoke loudly this time, voice echoing across the square. "I will not allow you to consume them all. You may rise from the earth, but I will bind you here." The entity shifted slightly, a movement subtle yet perceptible, like a shadow stretching across dimensions. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glimmered faintly. The children paused, responding not with fear, but recognition. Then, as the first rays of pre-dawn light touched the valley, the children retreated into the soil, leaving impressions of small hands across the square, traces of footprints, faint smudges along walls, and a lingering harmonic echo that pressed against consciousness like a physical weight. The entity, however, remained at the edge of the crooked tree, unmoved, watching, waiting. Its presence had grown stronger, tangible, oppressive, a sentinel guarding something unfathomable. The surviving settlers emerged slowly from their homes, shaken and silent. Many wept quietly. Some had lost family members, friends, neighbors, all swallowed by the valley or spirited away by hands unseen. Avery gathered them together, voice firm but low. "We survived tonight, but this is only the beginning. They are no longer confined to the cemetery. The valley itself obeys them, and soon our bodies, our minds, our lives will be tested in ways you cannot yet imagine." A micro cliffhanger closed the night. The harmonic resonance returned, this time faintly at first, then growing. A single faint shadow passed across the tavern window, not one of the 13 children, but taller, broader, more commanding. Avery's eyes narrowed, lips tightening. The entity was moving closer to the town, and in the wind, whispers began anew, not counting, but calling, summoning, marking. The night of the unfurling had begun, and San Pedro was no longer merely haunted. It was claimed. The morning after the night of the unfurling brought no relief. The valley lay under a pall of grey light, clouds pressing low against the mountains. The wind had stilled, leaving the streets of San Pedro in unnatural silence. Only the faint harmonic residue of the previous night lingered, a subtle vibration against walls, floors, and bones. The survivors moved cautiously, aware that every step could awaken the unseen. Avery had spent the pre-dawn hours preparing for confrontation. He traced wards through the town, reinforcing protective glyphs around the remaining homes. Each mark drew energy from the earth. Each chant strained his voice and body. Sweat ran down his face as he worked, but he did not pause. From the crooked tree, he could feel the entity observing him, measuring, calculating. The children were no longer visible. Their presence, however, was palpable. Tiny impressions pressed into the dust, faint whispers threaded through the air, and shadows flickered along walls even where no light fell. Avery understood that they were preparing, coordinating with the larger force. It was no longer a haunting, it was a siege. By mid-morning, the first full manifestation occurred. Roots erupted violently through the town square, breaking pavements and uprooting fences. The ground split in several places, revealing dark cavities from which thin, black tendrils snaked outward, curling around buildings and climbing toward remaining inhabitants. The survivors froze, some too terrified to even breathe. The entity emerged fully for the first time. It stood at the edge of the crooked tree, towering impossibly, limbs stretched and elongated beyond human proportion. Its form was vaguely humanoid, but distorted. Joints bent unnaturally, fingers ending in tapered points like claws, and a face that seemed simultaneously featureless and grotesquely detailed. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, revealing veins that pulsed with an unearthly blue light. The harmonic resonance emanating from it was overwhelming, pressing against perception, making hearts race and minds shudder. The children appeared alongside it, moving in perfect unison, circling the entity like extensions of its will. They had grown sharper, faster, more aware. Where before they had been spectral, now they were semi-solid, able to interact with the physical world, pressing against walls, doors, and the soil itself. Avery stepped forward, chanting. His voice quavered under the force of the harmonic pressure, yet he pressed on. I name you, bind you, contain you, by all that is sacred, by all that is lost, by the oath of the soil and the air, I command restraint. The entity paused, tilting its head slightly. For a moment, the wind carried a faint sigh, almost contemplative. Then, in a voice that resonated through the valley, deep and layered beyond comprehension, it spoke. You call human, and I listen. Yet you speak of restraint as if the world itself could obey your words. The children count, and I am their sum. The soil remembers, the valley remembers, and you, intruder, know nothing of what is sown. Avery's knees bent slightly under the weight of the voice. He had known the entity was ancient, older than the town, older than the first settlers, but he had not expected communication, not this early, not in this direct a form. One of the surviving settlers, a young woman named Eliza, whispered in horror, pointing toward the tree. It knows him, knows what he is doing. Avery's eyes narrowed. He did not answer. He understood without words that the entity had been feeding off repeated burials, off fear, grief, and ritual, learning, growing stronger with each disruption. It had gained intelligence, purpose, and now it was teaching the children to act with coordinated precision. The children moved closer to the survivors. They did not attack immediately, but they pressed an invisible pressure against the minds of the living, forcing them to relive memories, to confront sins, failures, regrets. Many screamed, clutching their heads. One man collapsed entirely, frothing at the mouth as spectral fingers clawed through his chest, tracing invisible patterns over his ribcage. Avery acted swiftly. He gestured, muttering protective liturgies, forcing the children back temporarily. Yet the entity shifted subtly, changing the rhythm of the valley itself. Dust rose in spirals, wind twisted in unnatural currents, and shadows moved in directions that made no sense. Reality itself seemed to bend, reacting to the entity's presence. Finally, Avery spoke aloud to the entity. Why? Why this place? Why these children? The voice came again, layered and resonant. Because they were sown here. Because grief called them. Because humans disturb what should not be touched. They were 13, and you buried them 13 times. With each act, they learned. With each act, they grew. And now, they are mine, and I am theirs. This valley is the cradle of what will come. The surviving settlers trembled at this revelation. The children were not merely spirits or victims. They were extensions of the entity, their consciousness woven into its own. Each small figure was a node of power, and the valley had become a network, feeding and responding to their master's will. Avery realized the scope of the danger. This was no longer a matter of containing the children, of preventing disappearances. This was a nexus point, a focal area where something ancient and malevolent had grown strong enough to manifest in the physical world, to bend reality itself. If unchecked, it would extend beyond the valley, beyond San Pedro, into surrounding lands. The first major casualty occurred within moments. A survivor who had ventured to flee tripped over a rising root which wrapped around his legs and pulled him into the earth. His scream was hollow, swallowed immediately by the harmonic resonance. No trace remained, save for a small handprint pressed into the dust where he had fallen. Avery acted with urgency. He drew upon every protective ward, every ritual gesture, every whispered litany he had memorized. He moved the remaining settlers toward the center of the town, toward a pattern of wards he hoped could create a temporary safe zone. The entity watched silently, observing, calculating, while the children hovered around the periphery, their harmonic counting now irregular, shifting unpredictably. In a final chilling revelation, Avery glimpsed the children's origin. When he touched one of the mounds at the crooked tree, he saw flashes of memory, visions of the original Wither's children, of their repeated reburials, of the rituals of grief performed over them, and finally, of the awakening of the entity beneath the soil. It had been there all along, patiently waiting, feeding, growing stronger with every act of remembrance and sorrow. By the time dawn broke fully, San Pedro was forever changed. The entity remained, towering and silent, observing the surviving few. The children had withdrawn into the soil, but the harmonic resonance lingered, an echo in every corner, a whisper in every shadow. Avery knew it would not relent. This was only the beginning. Macro cliffhanger. From beneath the valley, a deep rumbling began, unlike anything of the night before. Avery realized the entity was preparing to fully manifest, no longer restrained by soil or shadows. The valley would become its stage, and the children were ready to act as both heralds and army. By the third night after the first manifestation, San Pedro had become a town of shadows and whispers. No natural light penetrated the heavy clouds hanging low over the valley. The wind carried not dust or scents of rot, but the oppressive harmonic resonance of the entity and its children. Every living being remaining in the town felt its pressure in their bones, felt the air thickening with intent and malevolence. Avery moved with precision, guiding the survivors toward the tavern and its reinforced wards. Each step was measured. Every gesture of protection was meticulously performed. Yet even as he worked, he knew it was insufficient. The entity was no longer distant. It had extended tendrils into the streets, the buildings, the very soil. The children were everywhere at once, gliding, observing, counting. The survivors huddled in the tavern's central room, terrified and trembling. Faces pale, eyes wide, they dared not speak above a whisper. Each remembered those lost in the previous nights, Jeremiah, the carter's eldest son, and many others, all consumed by roots, shadows, or the children themselves. Avery moved between them, chanting protective incantations, tracing the air with glyphs that shimmered faintly as they anchored into the dust and walls. Outside, the valley pulsed with life that was not alive. Roots erupted violently through streets, climbing walls, twisting over rooftops. Windows shattered under the pressure, yet no wind passed through. The children moved in coordinated waves, sometimes passing through solid walls, sometimes interacting with the physical world. Their hollow eyes glimmered with knowledge, intelligence far beyond mortal comprehension. Their harmonic counting bending perception, warping time and memory for anyone who dared look upon them. Avery's focus was on the entity. From its position by the crooked tree, it had begun a slow, deliberate march toward the town centre. Its form towered above the valley, limbs stretching impossibly, skin pale and veined with unnatural light. It was no longer merely observing, it was orchestrating the children, feeding their movements with precision. Every micro-gesture of a hand, tilt of a head, or shift in weight of the children rippled outward, reshaping reality, warping the streets themselves. The first direct assault came swiftly. One child passed through a wall of the tavern, raising a tiny hand. The air thickened as the harmonic resonance pressed against the chest of the survivors. Panic seized them. One man tried to flee, but the floorboard beneath him split, roots snaking up to ensnare his legs. He screamed as the roots pulled him downward, his voice swallowed in a harmonic echo. The survivors cried out, but Avery's protective wards shielded them from complete psychic assault. Avery realized they were being tested. The entity was probing, studying the effectiveness of his protections, learning their weaknesses, observing fear as both tool and weapon. He recited protective chants louder, voice hoarse, tracing glyphs faster than ever before. Yet the valley itself seemed to rebel. Dust and debris swirled in spirals, shadows twisted unnaturally, and faint blue light flickered across the crooked tree. The children's counting accelerated. What had once been 13 precise beats now became chaotic, layered, unpredictable. The harmonic resonance bent perception of time. Moments stretched endlessly, breaths became weighted, and the survivors felt trapped in a liminal space where panic and dread were tangible forces. Avery turned to the entity, his voice raised above the cacophony. I will not allow you to consume them, to claim this place entirely. I bind you, I name you, I command restraint in the name of all that endures. The entity shifted slightly, acknowledging Avery's challenge. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glimmered with intelligence and recognition. Then it spoke, voice resonant and layered, filling the tavern and pressing into the very bones of the survivors. You resist, human, but the valley remembers, and the children obey. What is sown will rise, what is buried will count. You may attempt containment, but you cannot stop the tide. The nexus awakens, and you, interloper, know only fear. From the corners of the room, the harmonic resonance intensified. Avery felt it in his chest, a pressure that threatened to crush lungs and warp vision. The children passed through the tavern walls, solidifying briefly to touch, prod, and disturb. Their presence was overwhelming. The survivors collapsed to their knees, covering their faces, weeping silently, praying ineffectively, unable to comprehend the scale of what they faced. Avery realized there was only one solution. He had to engage directly with the entity, not to destroy. It could not be destroyed, but to force a standoff, to buy time for the remaining lives. He moved to the door, stepping into the streets. The children glided around him, forming a circle, counting, each step synchronized to the harmonic pulse. Roots and debris twisted underfoot, guiding him toward the crooked tree. The entity regarded him silently, then moved, a shadow stretching impossibly across the valley. Its limbs pressed into the soil, rising like enormous conduits, connecting with the children, merging control with them. The harmonic resonance grew unbearable, and the surviving settlers screamed from within the tavern, powerless. Avery extended his hands, chanting with every ounce of strength. Protective glyphs shimmered across the street, forcing the children to hesitate, their rhythm momentarily disrupted. He could feel the entity's intelligence probing, seeking weaknesses, calculating responses. The ground shook violently. Dust and debris rose in spirals, forming a vortex around the crooked tree, as if the town itself were participating in the ritual orchestrated by the entity. Then came the first major loss. Eliza, who had been holding the survivors together, stepped too close to the edge of the protective circle. A small hand emerged from the soil, pale and cold, pressing against her chest. The harmonic resonance intensified, and her eyes rolled back. She collapsed, limbs twitching as though the children's will pressed into her body. Avery rushed forward, but even his wards could not reach her fully. She disappeared into the earth, leaving only a faint echo of a scream. The remaining settlers shrank back in terror. Avery's face was pale, muscles taut. He realized the stakes. The valley had become a conduit. The children were extensions of the entity, and every living being was vulnerable. The entity had grown beyond the soil. It was now the valley itself, breathing, watching, calculating. Avery shouted once more, voice straining, chanting with desperation. I bind you, I name you, I force restraint. This nexus is not yours. The children paused, their motion halting, but the entity did not respond. From beneath the crooked tree, a low rumbling began, shaking the foundations of the town. Roots erupted violently, and the harmonic resonance reached a peak. Avery felt his consciousness stretch, strained against the psychic pressure emanating from the entity and its children. Macro cliffhanger. The entity lifted a colossal limb, and the harmonic resonance shifted. The valley itself seemed to pulse with awareness. The children formed a new pattern in the streets, converging toward the tavern in perfect synchronization. Avery knew that the next moments would determine not survival, but whether anything of San Pedro could ever endure. The full confrontation had begun. Night fell like a shroud over San Pedro, swallowing the valley in near-complete darkness. The sky was an oppressive grey, low clouds pressing against the mountains like a physical weight. Wind had ceased entirely. The air itself was heavy with psychic tension. Avery could feel it, each breath a struggle as the harmonic resonance pressed against chest, skull, and bones. The valley was alive in a way no human could survive without surrendering wholly to terror. The entity had advanced. Its towering form now occupied the center of the valley, limbs stretched across streets and rooftops, pressing against the soil. The children swirled around it, a vortex of pale shapes and counting whispers, synchronized to the entity's will. Their harmonic resonance had grown sharper, more precise, now bending perception. Seconds elongated into eternities, heartbeats stretched and compressed unpredictably, and memory intertwined with dread so thoroughly that past, present, and nightmare were indistinguishable. Avery moved carefully, leading the remaining survivors toward the tavern. Protective wards shimmered faintly across floors, walls, and thresholds. But he knew these would not hold for long. The entity had already demonstrated intelligence, adapting to his spells and incantations, testing weaknesses, observing fear, and learning from it. From the crooked tree, the entity lifted one colossal limb. The ground trembled, dust and soil spiraling into the air. Roots erupted from beneath buildings, climbing walls and snapping fences. The harmonic resonance became unbearable, pressing directly on the survivors' lungs and skulls. Avery spoke aloud, voice hoarse, chanting protective litanies. By soil, by air, by memory, I name and bind. You shall not pass, you shall not claim the living. His glyphs shimmered, creating a fragile bubble around the tavern. For a moment, the children recoiled slightly, hesitant, sensing resistance stronger than any before. But the entity was patient. Its voice, layered and omnipresent, reverberated through the valley. You resist, human, but the nexus calls. The children are mine, the soil remembers, and the valley obeys. You delay the inevitable, but what is sown will rise. What is buried will count. Your wards are fragile, your voice a whisper against eternity. Avery's chest heaved under the psychic pressure. He realized that direct confrontation was inevitable. He had to engage the entity fully, not merely resist. Every protective ward, every litany, every chant up to this point had only delayed the inevitable. The valley's corruption had grown too strong, and the children acted as extensions of the entity, amplifying its control over reality itself. He stepped into the street, confronting the entity directly. The children formed a perfect circle around him, their harmonic counting now chaotic and layered, pressing on his perception, stretching moments into nightmares. The survivors inside the tavern clutched at one another, trembling, unable to intervene. Avery extended his arms, chanting faster, louder, his voice rising to a scream. Protective glyphs shimmered along the streets, creating a lattice of fragile resistance. The entity's form shifted subtly, limbs bending in impossible ways, and the harmonic resonance intensified. Roots erupted beneath Avery's feet, attempting to ensnare him, but he countered with sigils, forcing them to coil harmlessly into the dirt. A micro cliffhanger occurred. One of the children broke from the circle, moving directly toward Avery. Its hand extended, pressing against the air just inches from his face. Time warped, seconds stretching into what felt like minutes. Avery's vision blurred, mind teetering on the edge of comprehension. In that moment, he glimpsed the entity's true form, not merely a creature of flesh and soil, but a nexus of memory, grief, and ritual older than the valley itself. The entity moved then, its colossal limbs pressing into the valley like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of terror. The children reacted instantly, circling and gliding, their forms semi-solid, interacting with the physical world as extensions of their master's will. Avery realized the full scale. This was no longer merely a haunting or localized anomaly. The valley had become a conduit, a stage for the entity to manipulate reality itself. Avery focused every ounce of strength, chanting protective rites, tracing complex glyphs in the air. Sparks of energy shot from the ground, following his gestures, weaving into a lattice that resisted the harmonic resonance. The children recoiled slightly, their rhythm momentarily disrupted. The entity paused, tilting its colossal head as though considering the human before it. Then came the first major casualty of the climactic confrontation. A survivor who had ventured too close to the protective barrier, a man named Robert, was seized by roots that erupted from beneath the tavern steps. The harmonic resonance intensified as the entity's power coursed through the children. Robert's scream was muffled almost immediately. His body twisted impossibly as spectral fingers traced over his chest and face, leaving only a faint imprint in the dust where he had fallen. Avery shouted, voice cracking, pouring all intent and will into the protective lattice. By every memory, every oath, every lost soul, I bind you. For a fleeting moment, the valley stilled. The children froze, the harmonic resonance faltered, and dust hung suspended in the air. The survivors gasped, uncertain whether hope had arrived or whether the pause was a prelude to further terror. The entity did not strike immediately. Instead, it observed, limbs bending, body shifting, as if weighing Avery's strength against the inevitable. The harmonic resonance returned, but now it carried new layers, memories of the dead, whispers of grief, and echoes of the repeated reburials that had fed its awakening. The children moved faster, more coordinated, responding to the entity's will with terrifying precision. Avery understood then what had to be done. Not to destroy, the entity could not be destroyed, but to force a standoff, to impose a limit, to prevent the valley's full domination for at least a fleeting moment. He extended his hands, fingers tracing the air, chanting with every ounce of strength. Glyphs flared across the ground, protective circles intertwined, a lattice of human will against cosmic inevitability. The children shrieked, harmonic counting breaking into cacophony. Their forms flickered between solidity and ghostly presence. Roots twisted violently beneath the streets. Dust rose into spirals, carried on non-existent wind, and the entity lifted a colossal limb, pressing against the lattice, the valley itself bending in response to its weight. Macro cliffhanger. The entity's harmonic resonance reached its peak, forcing Avery and the remaining survivors to their knees. The valley pulsed like a living organism, roots snapping, dust spiraling, shadows twisting unnaturally. Avery realized with absolute clarity the next action would determine the survival or total annihilation of San Pedro. The climax was complete, but the final consequence, the aftermath, was yet to be revealed. The dawn that followed the climactic night brought no warmth, no relief. The valley of San Pedro lay silent, but the silence was heavier than before, as if the very air carried the weight of the horrors that had unfolded. Smoke and dust hung in lazy swirls, shifting unnaturally, illuminated by the feeble light that managed to pierce the cloud cover. Roots, twisted and charred, clawed through streets and buildings, remnants of the entity's assault and the children's relentless movement. Avery moved among the survivors, his body trembling, voice hoarse from chanting, lungs strained from the oppressive harmonic resonance. He counted 12 remaining humans, 12 who had survived through a combination of instinct, wards, and sheer will. Each face bore the same haunted look, eyes wide, pupils dilated from prolonged exposure to psychic pressure, and hands trembling from the memory of what had been seen, touched, or sensed. The entity itself was gone, or perhaps it had receded, retreating into the soil, the valley, the very essence of the landscape. The children were no longer visible, but Avery could feel their presence. Faint whispers lingered, a harmonic echo in the corners of consciousness, reminding the living that the nexus had not ended. It had only withdrawn, its influence lingering like a shadow that refused to dissipate. Avery approached the center of the town square, where the last confrontation had taken place. The ground was scarred with spirals of dust and debris, impressions of tiny hands pressed into soil, and shards of shattered buildings. Protective glyphs he had drawn during the night were partially intact, flickering faintly, holding some measure of resistance against whatever force had surged through the valley. He knelt, tracing the edges of one particularly complex circle with his fingers, feeling the residual energy hum beneath his touch. One survivor, a young boy named Thomas, approached him cautiously. His small hands clutched at Avery's cloak, eyes wide and brimming with tears. "Are they gone? Is it over?" Avery shook his head slowly. "Number. They are never gone. The children, the entity, the valley itself remembers. What you saw, what you felt, will remain with you, and it will call again. Always, it will call." The survivors exchanged fearful glances. They had witnessed horrors that could not be unlearned, had felt psychic pressures that bent the mind and soul alike. Yet Avery knew their survival had come at a cost beyond mere numbers. Every protective ward, every chant, every act of resistance had required an imprint of his own essence. Fractions of his life, his consciousness, left behind in the lattice of psychic energy binding the valley. Each time he had acted, he had strengthened the entity in ways imperceptible until now. As they moved through the ruins, the harmonic resonance returned, not strong enough to harm, but enough to remind them that the valley had been claimed, that the children's counting and the entity's will were woven into the soil and dust. Avery noticed subtle shifts in the remnants of buildings, shadows lingering longer than natural, whispers brushing against thought at the edge of comprehension. The entity was patient, and the valley was a conduit. Avery paused at the crooked tree, the epicenter of the entity's power. Its bark was scorched and twisted, roots sprawling unnaturally across the ground. Beneath it, faint impressions of tiny hands marked the soil in concentric patterns, the children's lingering presence echoing the harmonic resonance they had wielded. He crouched, tracing one of the patterns with a trembling hand. A flash of insight struck him, a partial understanding of what had awakened this entity. Grief, repeated ritual, human obsession with counting and burial. The obsessive return to what should have been left undisturbed. The realization was horrifying. The children had never been independent. They were conduits, extensions of the entity's will, and the entity itself had fed on the valley, the repeated acts of human ritual and the terror of those who tried to resist. Avery understood that San Pedro's survival had not ended the threat. It had only delayed it. The entity had gained knowledge, experience, and now lay dormant, awaiting the next disturbance. One by one, the survivors fell silent, some kneeling in exhausted prayer, others simply staring at the ruined streets, too numb to comprehend the full scale of what had transpired. Avery moved among them, offering guidance, whispering the names of protective wards and litanies that might hold the valley in check for a time. Yet he knew it was only temporary. The entity would return, the children would rise again, and San Pedro, or some future settlement, would face the same nightmare. Avery's thoughts turned inward. He could feel his own essence fraying at the edges, threads of his consciousness left embedded in the valley's psychic lattice. He was alive, yes, but changed irrevocably. He carried with him a fragment of the entity's harmonic resonance, a faint echo in his mind that would never leave. He would dream the counting, hear the whispers, feel the pull of the valley in moments of solitude. He had survived, but he had been marked. A final casualty of the confrontation revealed itself, silently. Thomas, the young boy, approached Avery again, trembling. His eyes were drawn toward the shadows at the base of the crooked tree. "It's watching me," he whispered. Avery knelt, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. He felt it, a faint tug, a whisper in the edge of the mind. The harmonic resonance, though faint, had already begun to integrate into the boy. The cycle would continue. Avery looked out over the valley. The survivors, 12 in total, were diminished in body and spirit. The town was scarred and broken. Yet the entity remained, its consciousness intertwined with the soil, the ruins, and the lingering echoes of the children. San Pedro was alive in form only. In essence, it had become a vessel, a nexus, a warning. He spoke softly to the survivors. "We have survived, but the cost is immeasurable. The valley claims what it will. Remember this place, mark it in memory. It will awaken again, and when it does, it will not be merciful." The survivors nodded silently, the weight of his words pressing upon them as tangibly as the residual harmonic resonance. Avery took a final, lingering look at the crooked tree, feeling the pulse of something ancient beneath his feet. He knew that he would never be the same. The valley had changed him, had embedded a fragment of its consciousness within him. The wind returned then, gently stirring the dust and debris, carrying with it faint whispers. Not counting, not commands, but a call, a reminder, a summoning. The entity had retreated, yes, but it had left its mark, its essence, its inevitability. Avery knew that no human presence could ever truly leave the valley. To enter it again, even years later, would be to invite the same horror, to awaken what lay beneath. The survivors began to depart, tentative steps along twisted streets, leaving behind the ruined tavern and shattered homes. Avery lingered, placing one final protective glyph at the center of the square, embedding within it a fragment of his will. It was a small act of containment, a fragile reminder that while the valley's horror had not been eradicated, it could at least be delayed. As he finally turned to leave, Avery felt the harmonic resonance stir faintly in his own mind. A whisper, a pulse, a counting that had not existed before. The entity had marked him, just as it had marked the valley. Its influence was now within him, an echo that would never fade. He would carry it forward, a warning to those who might encounter the valley in the future, a reminder that some horrors could never truly be destroyed. The final image lingered, the crooked tree, silhouetted against a grey, unyielding sky. Its roots spread across the valley like veins and faint handprints, the children's imprint, etched themselves permanently into soil and stone. The harmonic resonance pulsed faintly, a heartbeat beneath the world, a presence waiting, patient, inevitable. The valley was quiet, but it was not safe. It was waiting for the next disruption, the next burial, the next act of human obsession to awaken what should never have risen. San Pedro survived, but only in form. The entity, the children, and the valley's memory remained. And Avery, marked and changed, walked away, carrying the echo of counting and whispers within his mind, a living testament to the horrors that had unfolded, and a warning that the nightmare was far from over.